Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. He thought he'd left conflict behind, but when a fake officer in tactical gear storms his quiet Texas property, demanding compliance with HOA rules he never agreed to, a retired FBI agent realizes his greatest battle won't be in war zones, but right at his front gate. George Whitaker had spent most of his life dealing with high-stakes situations as a Navy veteran and later as a respected FBI agent. But retirement had brought him peace. Finally, at 72, he settled on a quiet piece of land on the outskirts of a Texas town, far from the noise and stress he'd known in his former career. His house sat on a few serene acres, with peach trees lining the back and a gravel driveway that twisted like a lazy river through a grove of oaks. He spent his days tending the garden, repairing his vintage motorcycle, and reading in a hammock with his loyal beagle, Rufus, asleep by his feet. That peace was one of the main reasons his grandson Alex had moved in with him temporarily. A 30-year-old IT specialist who worked remotely, Alex wanted a break from the chaos of city life. George was glad to have the company. The two got along well, sharing a love for black coffee, war documentaries, and grilled steak on Sundays. Life had a rhythm, simple, quiet, and undisturbed, until the day Rick showed up. It was a blazing hot Tuesday when a black SUV rolled up the gravel driveway unannounced. George was out back, pruning a low-hanging peach branch while Alex worked on the porch with his laptop. The vehicle came to a dramatic halt, and out stepped a man in what looked like a law enforcement uniform, tan cargo pants, tactical boots, a black vest labeled Community Enforcement Unit, and a large, shiny badge clipped to his belt. He walked like he expected people to salute. "Excuse me, sir," the man called out, approaching George with an air of self-importance. "I'm Officer Rick Blake, Silver Palms HOA Compliance Division. We've had some reports regarding property violations." George squinted at him, unimpressed. "HOA," he repeated slowly, resting both hands on the garden shears. "Son, I'm not part of any HOA." Rick smirked and tapped a thick manila folder he carried under his arm. "Actually, this entire sector falls under Silver Palms HOA jurisdiction. Your property, sir, is non-compliant with our guidelines for fencing, landscaping, and structure color. We'll need to do an inspection, standard procedure." Alex, hearing the exchange, came down the steps quickly. "Hold on. What jurisdiction? This house predates Silver Palms by decades. It's not in your boundaries." Rick turned to him sharply. "Are you authorized to speak for the property owner?" George gave Alex a slight nod, then looked Rick straight in the eye. "I've lived here 23 years, son. Bought it outright. Never signed a single thing connecting me to your little neighborhood club, so you can take that folder and your inspection and turn around." Rick's smile thinned. "If you don't comply, there will be fines, possibly even enforcement actions. We don't make exceptions." George didn't blink. "Then you'll be trespassing, and I still remember how to deal with that." Rick hesitated just a little too long, then turned and left, muttering something about non-cooperative elements as he stomped back to his SUV. The tires spit gravel as he sped off. Alex looked at George. "What was that?" George wiped his brow and chuckled dryly. "That, son, was trouble wearing a cheap badge." The next morning, George stepped outside to retrieve his mail and found the box stuffed to the brim with envelopes, far more than usual. Curious, he carried the bundle into the kitchen and began sorting through them at the table while Alex sipped coffee across from him. Each envelope bore the gaudy, overly formal crest of the Silver Palms HOA embossed in gold foil. Inside were citations, dozens of them. "Violation notice, improper fence height. Warning, lawn non-compliance. Fine assessment, unauthorized American flag display." George stared at the stack with a raised brow. "Unauthorized flag," he said dryly. "That's a new one." Alex grabbed a few envelopes and began flipping through them. "These aren't even real legal documents. Look at the formatting. It's amateur hour, and they're clearly automated. There's no signature, no legal clause references, nothing binding." Still, the message was clear. Rick wasn't acting alone. Silver Palms HOA had decided to retaliate. Later that day, things escalated. A luxury SUV rolled into the gravel drive and parked with the engine running. Out stepped a well-dressed woman in heels and a stiff magenta blazer. She looked around like she'd just entered a landfill. Her heels sunk slightly into the dirt path, but she soldiered forward, clipboard in hand and a Bluetooth headset on her ear. "Good afternoon," she said in the kind of tone that suggested it was anything but. "I'm Karen Woods, president of the Silver Palms HOA. We need to have a serious conversation about your property's appearance." George leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed. "We really don't." Karen ignored the remark. "Your unpainted trim is visible from the road. Your porch swing is rusting. And that," she pointed disdainfully at the American flag fluttering in the breeze, "is clashing with our community's neutral palette." Alex nearly choked on his coffee. "The flag is clashing?" Karen turned her gaze on him. "We maintain strict visual harmony within Silver Palms. Your property, though technically adjacent, falls within our visual influence zone. You are therefore subject to the aesthetic regulations outlined in our community charter." George's eyes narrowed. "Let me stop you right there. I've lived here long before your HOA sprouted up. My land was never annexed. I never signed a deed restriction, and no visual influence gives you the right to tell me how to paint my porch." Karen's expression remained stiff, but her voice took on a sharper edge. "Non-compliance will result in escalating measures. I'd strongly recommend cooperation." George simply turned and walked back inside without another word, the screen door creaking behind him. Alex, still on the porch, smiled politely. "Have a wonderful day, Ms. Woods." As she stalked off to her SUV, Alex looked down the driveway and shook his head. "Grandpa," he said as he re-entered the house, "we've got ourselves a full-on HOA crusade." George, unbothered, poured himself another cup of coffee. "Let them crusade. We've dealt with worse." Alex was never one to sit back and let a situation spiral unchecked, especially not when the opposition was a group of overreaching HOA zealots with delusions of legal authority. After Karen's dramatic visit, he decided it was time to do what he did best: set a digital trap and expose the circus for what it really was. The first step was surveillance. George's property was already outfitted with a few basic motion lights and a weathered old trail cam, but Alex wanted eyes on every angle. He ordered a suite of smart security cameras with night vision, license plate recognition, and motion alerts. By the weekend, he had them installed discreetly along the driveway, the perimeter fence, and both porches, back and front. They were all linked to a private server and a cloud backup, which meant every intrusion would be recorded, time-stamped, and preserved. Not long after installation, the cameras captured footage of HOA volunteers walking slowly along the property edge, one of them holding a clipboard and snapping photos of George's house through the trees. Another vehicle, a familiar black SUV, crept by twice in one afternoon, the driver, Rick, clearly scanning the yard. That's when Alex activated Phase 2, the Wi-Fi trap. He set up a rogue wireless network with the name Silver Palms HOA network. Open access, no password, but with a twist. The moment someone connected, the system would log their MAC address, capture metadata from any pinged apps or services, and flag their device on a network map. It didn't give Alex full access to their phones, of course. He wasn't a hacker, but it did reveal just enough to identify patterns. Sure enough, one evening, while Alex and George were enjoying grilled ribs on the porch, the trap got a bite. Two devices pinged the fake network from the road outside. One of them immediately tried to access what looked like a shared drive. Clearly, someone thought they were connecting to an internal HOA resource. Alex grinned. "Gotcha." Later that night, while combing through the device logs, Alex discovered the smoking gun, a file cache with thumbnail previews of images. One was a poorly edited map that tried to redraw George's property lines to include it under HOA boundaries. Another was a screenshot from a group chat titled SPHOA Enforcement with a message from Karen. "If he won't comply voluntarily, we'll escalate. Code enforcement is friendly with us. Just need the right paperwork." Alex's expression turned grim. "They're planning to fabricate complaints." The next morning, Alex compiled everything: footage, logs, screenshots, and file metadata into a tidy evidence packet and emailed it to his friend Sasha, a county attorney he'd worked with on a cybersecurity contract 2 years earlier. Within the hour, she called. "This is gold," she said. You've got coordinated harassment, digital impersonation, and potential document fraud. If they try to file anything official, we can hit back hard." Alex hung up and turned to George, who was sharpening pruning shears at the kitchen table. "We're not just pushing back anymore," Alex said. "We're going on offense." George looked up, calm as ever. "Good. I was starting to get bored." If the HOA had been bold before, now they were becoming unhinged. The first sign came buzzing over the pecan trees one breezy afternoon. A mid-sized quadcopter drone, black and chrome, hovering noisily above George's backyard. At first, George thought it was some kid's toy, but when the drone swooped lower and began circling the porch like a mechanical vulture, it became clear it was no harmless plaything. The drone had a speaker. It crackled to life with a grating, pre-recorded voice. "This property is in violation of HOA visual ordinances. Please submit compliance documents immediately to avoid penalties." George stood on the porch, squinting at the drone like it had just insulted his dog. Without saying a word, he picked up a broom and took a slow, measured step forward. The drone dipped lower, as if taunting him, but before it could back away, George swung with military precision. The broom connected with a loud crack, and the drone spiraled out of the air and landed in a mangled mess among the roses. Rufus the beagle barked once in approval. Alex came running outside. "Tell me that wasn't a hallucination." George nudged the wreckage with his boot. "Nope, that was real." But the drone was only the beginning. Over the next 3 days, 3 more drones showed up. One even flew at night, its red light blinking like an airborne threat. Alex caught it on the cameras and traced its flight path back to the HOA's clubhouse down the road. Each drone carried the same message, the same robotic warnings, as if the HOA was staging a bizarre psychological operation. That Friday, things got worse. At 3 a.m., motion alerts from the backyard camera woke Alex. He rolled out of bed and grabbed his phone, heart pounding. The feed showed 2 figures in hooded sweatshirts sneaking along the edge of the tool shed. One of them held bolt cutters. The other was trying to pry open the camera mount on the back wall. Alex whispered, "We've got company." George was already awake. In fact, he'd expected this. That very day, he had rigged a simple deterrent. Fishing wire stretched low across the path, connected to a motion-triggered floodlight, and a recorded warning. While Alex dialed the sheriff, George slipped on his boots and moved through the shadows like a man half his age. The second the intruders crossed the tripwire, the yard exploded with light and the recording blared. "This is private property. You are being recorded. Law enforcement has been notified." Startled, one of the men fell hard, landing in a patch of mulch with a groan. The other bolted toward the gate, cursing. George stepped out from behind the garden shed, flashlight in one hand, a pump-action air horn in the other. He blasted it once, and the fleeing figure stumbled again before disappearing over the fence. Alex arrived with a baseball bat just in time to see the remaining man, clearly Rick, based on the size and retreating silhouette, limp after his partner. The sheriff arrived 12 minutes later, lights flashing across the dew-covered lawn. The deputies took statements, reviewed the footage, and promised to follow up. But George wasn't rattled. He sipped his coffee the next morning, scanning the sunrise like a man waiting for the next chapter. "I've been under real surveillance," he said as Alex replayed the footage. This is just amateur hour." It was a blistering Saturday afternoon when Rick finally snapped. The air was thick with humidity and desperation, and George's land sat beneath a sky so blue it seemed almost staged. The quiet rustle of leaves and the chirp of cicadas were the only sounds until the silence shattered. Tires screeched at the end of the gravel drive. Alex looked up from the porch just as a familiar black SUV slammed to a stop in front of the gate. The door flung open with theatrical rage, and out stepped Rick Blake, his face twisted in something between righteous fury and pure delusion. But this time, he wasn't wearing his usual fake security getup. This time, he was in full tactical cosplay. Black cargo vest, mirrored sunglasses, thigh holster strapped like he was about to breach a compound, and inside that holster, unmistakably, was a real firearm. George stepped out from the side of the house, calmly wiping his hands on a rag, having just oiled his old mower. He froze mid-step, eyes narrowing at the weapon as Rick stormed forward, shouting, "George Whitaker, under the authority of Silver Palms HOA, you are hereby being detained for repeated violations of community code. Drop any tools and prepare for inspection." Alex stood up, voice steady but rising. "You're insane. You're on private property. You're not law enforcement, and that weapon." "I am the law here," Rick screamed, drawing the pistol and pointing it, hand shaking, straight at George. Time stopped. Even the wind seemed to still. George didn't flinch. He simply stared, his eyes hard and eerily calm, like a man who'd looked down more than a few barrels in his life. One hand slowly, casually, reached for the smartwatch on his wrist and tapped a single button. Unseen to Rick, that tap triggered a silent alarm, a custom signal linked directly to George's old FBI unit. A system set up for emergencies that might come, not from international criminals, but from petty tyrants with too much ego and too little sense. Rick was still ranting. "We gave you chances, old man. You had your warning. Now we do things my way. HOA code enforcement is not a joke." Alex was frozen, hands raised, calculating every possible move between them and cover. George, on the other hand, merely tilted his head, voice gravelly and low. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." 3 minutes passed. Rick paced back and forth with the gun still raised, barking nonsense about bylaws and citations. And then, low in the distance, came the sound. Engines. Multiple SUVs, black as night, roaring down the road toward the property. Rick blinked, then froze. The convoy emerged from the trees like a scene out of an action film. 3 unmarked FBI tactical vehicles flanked by a county sheriff cruiser. Doors swung open before the wheels even stopped, and out poured a wave of fully armed agents in vests, headsets, and mirrored glasses. Rick took one look at the community enforcement patch on his chest, then back at the agents surrounding him. Glocks drawn, voices firm. "Drop the weapon. Hands in the air. Now." Rick's brain couldn't seem to keep up. He looked from George to Alex, to the real agents closing in, and his pistol fell to the grass with a clatter. A tall man in a gray suit and aviator stepped forward. Special Agent Marcus Dillard, George's old partner. "Rick Blake," he said coldly, "you are under arrest for brandishing a weapon, aggravated assault, trespassing, impersonating law enforcement, and about a half dozen other things we'll list later." As Rick was cuffed and read his rights, his mouth opened and closed, fish-like, unable to speak. When he finally found his voice, it was a whisper of disbelief. "But I thought I had authority." George stepped beside Agent Dillard, arms crossed. "You had nothing but a fake badge and a god complex." As the agents loaded Rick into the cruiser, Alex let out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline finally left him. He turned to George, who looked completely unshaken. "You knew they'd show up that fast." George shrugged, lips twitching into a dry smile. "Told you I still had friends." And just like that, Rick's fantasy of power collapsed under the weight of the real thing. The courthouse was packed. Word of the incident had spread like wildfire across the county, and now every pew in the gallery was filled with reporters, HOA members, curious locals, and more than a few smirking neighbors who had their own long-held grievances against Silver Palms. The trial of Rick Blake, and by association the entire HOA, had become the spectacle of the season. It wasn't every day that a fake officer pulled a gun on a retired FBI agent and lived to regret it. At the plaintiff's table sat George Whitaker, immaculately dressed in a crisp navy suit that somehow made him look even more authoritative. Beside him was Alex, armed with a laptop and an organized binder of evidence so detailed it would make a federal prosecutor proud. Their attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Sandra Clark, exuded quiet power. On the opposing side sat the visibly diminished leadership of the Silver Palms HOA. Karen Woods among them, her usual smugness eroded into tightly folded hands and darting eyes. And Rick, shackled in a county orange jumpsuit, seated slightly apart under the wary watch of 2 bailiffs. The judge, an older man with snowy hair and a reputation for having zero patience for theatrics, called the session to order. Sandra rose first. Her voice was measured, but every word hit like a hammer. "Your Honor, this is not merely a case of one man's reckless actions. This is about a community organization that overstepped every legal boundary imaginable, attempting to assert authority over a private citizen who never signed, never agreed, and never participated in their association." She clicked a remote, and a projection screen lit up with drone footage, the ones that flew over George's land. One by one, Sandra laid out the pattern. Forged maps, fake citations, falsified HOA notices, the text messages from Karen coordinating pressure campaigns, and finally, the footage of Rick pointing a loaded firearm at George on his own property. In their desperate bid for control, Sandra said, pacing slowly, they conspired, trespassed, harassed, and endangered lives. Rick Blake may have been the trigger man, but Silver Palms HOA built the gun. The defense scrambled. Karen's lawyer insisted that Rick had acted independently, that the board was unaware of his escalating behavior, that they'd never sanctioned his impersonation. Sandra raised a brow. Then how do you explain this? She pulled up the group chat logs. Karen, Rick, and several board members. One message read, "If George won't listen, Rick will make him." Murmurs filled the courtroom. The judge pounded his gavel. Silence. Then came the testimony. Alex took the stand, walking the jury through the surveillance setup, the Wi-Fi trap, and the collected digital evidence. The jury listened, transfixed, as he explained how Rick's phone had auto-connected to the fake network, leaking everything from HOA directives to altered land surveys. And when George took the stand, the courtroom fell into reverent quiet. His voice was calm, firm, but beneath the poise was steel. "I served this country for nearly 4 decades," he said. "I've stared down real threats. I never expected one to come from a man pretending to enforce paint colors. But what he did, what they all did, wasn't just absurd, it was dangerous. When that man pointed a gun at me, he wasn't just breaking the law, he was violating every principle of civil liberty and private property we hold sacred." The jury didn't take long. They returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts for Rick Blake. Aggravated assault, unlawful impersonation, criminal trespass, and brandishing a weapon with intent to intimidate. The civil ruling hit even harder. The court ordered Rick to pay George $500,000 in damages for emotional distress and threat to life. Silver Palms HOA was found jointly liable for coordinating harassment and enabling illegal conduct, fined heavily, and ordered to submit to state-supervised restructuring. Karen slumped in her seat, pale and speechless. As court adjourned, George stood, nodded politely to the judge, and walked out flanked by Alex and Sandra. Cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, neighbors applauded. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "They took down the whole HOA." George simply adjusted his cufflinks and stepped into the sunlight. Justice had been served, and not the HOA kind, the real kind. A month had passed since the gavel came down in court, but the echoes of that verdict were still rippling through the Silver Palms community. The HOA was a shadow of its former self. Half the board had resigned in disgrace. Karen had disappeared from public view entirely, and the neighborhood's once feared compliance patrols had vanished like smoke. The world had moved on, but George Whitaker's property remained exactly the same, proud, peaceful, and very much his. To celebrate, George and Alex decided to host something rare in their usually quiet corner of Texas, a full-blown backyard barbecue. Invitations weren't mailed, they were hand-delivered. No RSVPs required. Word traveled fast. By Saturday afternoon, families from both within and outside of Silver Palms trickled through the gate carrying folding chairs, homemade sides, and cautiously optimistic smiles. A long table was set up under the pecan trees, draped in red-checkered cloth and loaded with ribs, brisket sweet tea, and George's famous homemade peach preserves. Alex had even printed special labels. Freedom Peach, best served without HOA oversight. The air buzzed with laughter and the smell of grilled meat. Kids played tag between the trees. Old-timers sipped lemonade and swapped stories. Several neighbors approached George throughout the day, some to thank him, others to apologize for not standing up sooner. "You gave us our neighborhood back," one woman said, holding his hand with both of hers. "I didn't think anyone could stand up to them. But you made it look easy." George gave a modest shrug. "Just did what needed doing." As the sun began to set, Agent Dillard, his old FBI partner, arrived in a crisp polo, carrying a six-pack and a lopsided cake with the words HOA Free Zone piped in shaky blue icing. He raised a toast that got the entire yard laughing. "To George Whitaker," he said, lifting his cup, "who proved that when a fake cop pulls a gun on the wrong man, sometimes the best response is 20 years of federal connections and one hell of a broom swing." Alex laughed so hard he nearly spilled his plate. Rufus barked in approval, tail thumping under the table. As dusk settled over the yard, the sky painted in pink and amber, lanterns flickered to life, and the fire pit crackled in the center of the lawn. Alex looked around at the crowd. Once strangers, now connected not by rules or regulations, but by something better, mutual respect and the hard-won joy of living unbothered. He nudged George, who was quietly sipping coffee and watching the flames. "Think they'll ever try anything like that again?" Alex asked. George smirked. "If they do, I've still got the cameras. And the broom." Laughter echoed into the evening. The flag on the porch fluttered in the warm wind, and somewhere in the kitchen, another batch of Freedom Peach was cooling on the counter, ready for whatever came next. Not that anything would. No one dared mess with George Whitaker anymore.